Lagahani Dawado. I am Jay Hanna, and it is my honor to be here today. Before I get started into my remarks, isn't it wonderful to be in Tahlequah? It's wonderful to be in a room where I look at and I see Gohust. I see lots of cousins here today, and people that are wanting to know if I'm going to tell the truth or if I'm just going to make something up. And I will have to produce materials throughout today to show that the amazing story that we're going to tell is absolutely true, and it is an amazing story. But before I go there, and it was already mentioned about our Cherokee Lodge providing a very appropriate backdrop for today. As a matter of fact, this could be the central theme of this talk because it was what Catherine and I had discussed once before in mentioning that I am a member of Cherokee Lodge number 10, the oldest actual oldest Masonic lodge in the state of Oklahoma, dating to 1848. I'll speak to the details of that later. But our Secretary Wilson is here, and his daughter, and I want to thank him personally. Delbert has been an absolute stalwart of our lodge for well over 13 years as the lodge secretary. And as I was mentioning to someone earlier, for those of you that are not of the Masonic fraternity, yes, there's always a master of the lodge and there's other officers, but we rely upon the lodge secretary to keep everything in good working order. And so I am so thankful for our lodge to have brought forward this great artifact that I'm going to share with you today. Now, I have to tell you the very beginnings of my interest in Sam Houston. It came when I was probably 10, 11 years old, and my grandmother, Star, whose mother was a Benj, said, "We're going to go visit family graves," which is a great tradition in our family. And we made our way, oddly enough, to Fort Gibson National Cemetery. And I thought, well, this will be interesting. As a youngster, I was fascinated by seeing the cannon barrels that were being used for fence posts and a variety of other things there. And then we went to the officer circle. Now, the officer circle is allegedly individuals who were prominent as related to Fort Gibson prior to the American Civil War, and those potentially after. And we walked to the grave of what would be my fifth great-grandfather. And there on his headstone it says, Sam Houston Benj. Next to that grave is a smaller headstone. It says Talahina, wife of Sam Houston. Now, as a child, I was a bit confused because, wait a minute, here's Sam Houston's wife, but here's Sam Houston Benj, and it would be later on, cousin, that I would figure out that whether your name is William Wirt or whether your name is Sam Houston, if you come among the Cherokees and you honor our traditions and you honor our culture, we will name our children for you, and those names will live on forever. If you drive south on United States Interstate 45 to Huntsville, Texas, there along the east side of the road, you're going to see something that's pretty amazing. And today, we're just going to take a very simple trip. And what you would see there in the piney woods of south central Texas is the tallest statue of any individual in the entire United States. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but Texans claim it. It is their big claim to fame, that's for certain. It stands over 80 feet tall there in the piney woods, staring out over the interstate. And I would tell you that in so many ways, ladies and gentlemen, that statue is just not tall enough. Born in Virginia, raised in Tennessee, lived among the Cherokees, both in our eastern homelands and among the western Cherokees, and inevitably, he was always bound for Texas. Now, if there's any individual in our nation's history who can be said to have been bigger than life, that phrase might just be attached to Sam Houston. He was born in Rockbridge County, Virginia on March 2nd of 1793, and as he liked to tell people, it was just 2 days before the second inauguration of George Washington as President of the United States. Sam was one of 8 children to a Scotch-Irish family who had immigrated to the Commonwealth of Virginia in the 1730s. They settled into Shenandoah Valley. Sam's father, also named Samuel Houston, had served in Morgan's Rifles during the American Revolution and had somewhat of a checkered career in farming and also in the mercantile business. He unexpectedly passed away in 1807, and young Sam's mother, Elizabeth, did what any resourceful single mom would have done at that time. She sold everything that they had for cash and left Virginia and most of their creditors behind them. She had 9 kids, she had 5 slaves and 2 milk cows, and they headed for Tennessee. And many of the family's fame and fortune would in fact be situated there in Tennessee, as we Cherokees would want to pronounce it. They settled near Maryville, Tennessee, just south of Knoxville, and just north of Tahlequah, and they're set about farming and operating a store. Now, with that many kids and that many issues going on, it was a challenge for Elizabeth to keep this family together. Sam was not one for the ordinary, and farming and storekeeping, well, those were ordinary chores. So as a teenager, young Sam would often retire to the woods, allegedly for hunting purposes. Sometimes he'd be gone for days, sometimes for weeks, and then it would turn into even months. And it is there at the confluence of the Tennessee and the Hiwassee rivers that he met with a hunting party of young Cherokees. Sam followed them to their tribal town, and there was taken in by Tahlequah, one of the great chiefs commonly known here in this part of the country as John Jolly. Sam settled among the Cherokees and became an ardent and dedicated student of our customs, our traditions, but most importantly of our language. Bright young man, not much schooling, but his real schooling happened among the Cherokees. He was given the name of Talahina, the raven. He had black hair, and I'm certain that there's a great possibility that between his hair and his penchant for speech, that the talk of the raven and the squawking may have been equally connected. It was his language skills, though, both in Cherokee and English, that elevated him to the role of liaison eventually between the Cherokees and the United States. And that worked out on every occasion, especially where there was an annexation of Cherokee land. Now, I've been asked before I came up here today by some of my cousins and some of my dear friends. They go, so Sam Houston, Jay, is he a hero or is he a villain? And in actuality, I think he may have been a little bit of both. And it depends on which era that you want to look at. Because yes, he was there in those early days, prior to the Hiwassee Purchase, prior to what would ultimately be the old settlers removal, prior to Chief Doublehead, prior to many of the treaties that continued to diminish the land holdings of the Cherokees in the East. He was there. Records are not clear whether he was pro-Cherokee and trying to negotiate the very best for them, or if he was in fact pro-white in trying to see to it that the United States would come out on the best end of those trades. Either way, we know this for certain. The Cherokee Nation continued to shrink, and Houston, oddly enough, continued to be someone that was accepted on both sides. Now, aside from hunting and fishing, he also ran a tab with several traders, mostly for whiskey, I understand. He was a man who believed in staying away from the possibility of contaminated water, and the ingestion of alcohol would save him of any gastric problems. He had run up a debt of almost $200. Now, as a banker, I have not calculated present day, but I think that would be well into the thousands. It was a sizable sum at that particular time. And he then seized upon the creative idea of being able to get out of debt because he had been a bit of a student there in the Hiawassee area, and he decided that he would create his own private school. Now, much like those pesky Texans, the Tennesseans also like to make claims as well. And they will tell you that Sam Houston's private school that he started was in fact the very first one in the entire state of Tennessee. He held himself out as a master educator. And Sam was noted himself of saying later on that the only thing that saved him from the fact that the parents, or saved him with the fact that the parents of his students were of such sufficient ignorance as to not fully understand the lack of pedagogical prowess that he was plying there with his students. He earned enough to pay off his debts, though, and by the time he was 20 years old, another career shift happens. He decides he's going to join the United States Army, and he did so. U.S. Army, of course, quite involved with those pesky British showing up for the War of 1812, and it was in full force and effect at that particular time. Now, if you look at Houston's profile in this particular era, you'll find that he had adapted and adopted the Cherokee mythology. He understood our tribal dances. He understood our tribal customs. He had become quite adroit with our language and began to take on the persona, so much so that, as many other mixed bloods of this particular era, difficult to tell, is he Cherokee or is he white or is he both? These things happened without problem. I do know that his real claim to fame, though, once again another transition, occurs with a war inside of a war. If you look at the War of 1812, there was in fact Andrew Jackson's decision to wage war against the Creeks, particularly the Red Sticks, a group of Creek noblemen that had decided that we should shun the white ways, that we should in fact bring war against them, and if we need to treat with the British to throw off these pesky Americans, we will do just that. By the time of his 20th birthday, as I mentioned, he had enlisted in the United States Army. So the Creek Wars, under full force and effect, it was there that they were pressing at a place that most would know in our Cherokee history as being the Battle of Moccasin Bend. I'm going to refer to a text, and I'm so thankful, Catherine, for this opportunity to speak to this group because it has pushed me back into my library once again. So Andrew Jackson and the Indian Wars simply states that his order was instantly greeted with joy from his soldiers. We're speaking of Andrew Jackson, who was leading the conflict against the Creeks at Moccasin Bend. Never were men more eager to lead a charge than both regulars and militia, reported Jackson to Pickaninny. Now, I would tell you that among these militia units was also a large unit of Cherokees that were serving with this particular group as well, fearing that if we do not put down this Creek rebellion, there's great possibility this will overflow into the Cherokee country. When you look down that list, and there's not a detailed list, oftentimes we have to look through the records to find names of leaders. I do know that one of our common ancestors by the name of Caleb Starr is referred to later about 1818 as Captain Starr, and he didn't get that title simply because he was a negotiator of treaties. He got that at this particular battle. Back to Houston. The troops rushed forward under an unrelenting hail of Indian bullets and arrows, and the 39th Regiment, the Regiment of Houston, reached the barrier first and thrust their rifles through the portholes, firing at point-blank range. The Creeks had built a breastworks of logs there and were heavily defended on this peninsula in the river. For a time, it was muzzle-to-muzzle shooting in which many of the enemy's musket balls were welded to the bayonets of our muskets. Major Montgomery leaped on top of the breastworks and commanded his men to follow. His words had hardly been spoken when a bullet struck him in the head and he fell lifeless to the ground. Ensign Sam Houston immediately took Montgomery's place and repeated the command, whereupon an arrow pierced his thigh as he led the attack. That attack and that wound would figure prominently into the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. March 27th, 1814, young Houston saw an opportunity for fame. At the moment, I think it was just a military rush, but in actuality, it was at the attention of Andrew Jackson himself. Houston lay in an aid station, unattended. His friend had removed the arrow. We're having lunch, so I will not give great detail that is historically identified, but it was in kind of a private place. We'll just say that for a moment. He actually returned to the battlefield and there led a second attack where he was wounded in the shoulder and in the arm. This time he was taken back to an aid station, and as you can imagine what medical conditions were in 1814, surgeon said, "There's nothing I can do for you. If I start to do anything at all, this will simply relate to the misery of your death." Houston was a man to not give up easily. He was still alive the next morning. As a matter of fact, he survived that battle, or obviously we would not be talking about him here today. The cost of the day ended the Creek War. It is said to have been validating of the casualties, and I apologize for lunch, but 931 noses were removed from the dead as proof of their demise, and 300 prisoners were taken. Still, Houston saw little future as being a military hero, and he resigned his commission and he decided to study law. Here's another transition for us. We have moved from being kind of a runaway kid to living among the Cherokees and almost living out a dual life to being a military hero to now he's decided to, heaven forbid, become a lawyer. It is said that he completed a 2-year course in 6 months. And back then, just as it was up until only the 20th century, you could sit for the bar exam, and if you passed, you were admitted to the bar, and he was indeed. As a matter of fact, he was elected district attorney there in the area of Tennessee. Now, General Jackson was now Governor Jackson, and he appointed Houston as commander of the state militia. Once again, a reward for what had happened at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And also recognizing now his educational prowess had moved to the forefront in being an attorney. Andrew Jackson became both a political operative for Houston as well as a mentor and in many ways a father figure. These two really begin to weld together. And that's where oftentimes we Cherokees totally dismiss Sam Houston. Well, if he was with Jackson, there's no way that he could be anything of importance for us to know about. Now, for my Cherokee speakers, we will all know that the Cherokee word for devil is Askina, unless you go to Bull Hollow. Yeah, up in Delaware County, you go up there and you ask them what the Cherokee word is for devil, and they will tell you, oh, it's Jackskina. They've taken the name of Andrew Jackson and glued it on there. Although I'm not certain that they know why in Bull Hollow. They did at one time, but I don't know that they do today. Those two were thick as thieves, as my granny would say. And he continued his working relationship also among the Cherokees as a facilitator and negotiator with President Monroe for the early Cherokee removals, the Hiawassee Purchase that I mentioned earlier of 1818. And he's now there in that negotiation. He's befriended Chief Bowl. But let's hold that relationship for later and for another moment. In the spring of 1823, Houston is elected to the 9th Congressional District of the United States House of Representatives. This is the same election that Andrew Jackson is elected to the United States Senate. Now, this is where I get in trouble, and I'm so glad the stage is near that door that I can rush out of as soon as I finish, because I will make some contemporary analogies here. If you go back and read the rhetoric of United States Senator Andrew Jackson, Remember, this is in the 1820s. He had his eye on something called Texas even at that time. He was in favor of the United States potentially annexing Texas from Mexico as though it were Canada or Greenland. But we'll save that for later as well. Washington was a fascinating place for both Jackson and for Sam Houston. Remember, he's unmarried. Remember, he ran up a $200 whiskey bill earlier on, and Washington was quite the place. He was a ladies' man. So much so that the amount of courting that he was about, he actually dated Mary Custis. And many of you will say, well, who is that? She was one of the great nieces of George Washington, and that relationship didn't bloom, and she married a man by the name of Robert E. Lee later. So in many ways, we talk about Houston, we're talking about brushes with greatness as well. The man was sort of somewhere between Mother Teresa and Forrest Gump. He just absolutely was touching everybody at every conceivable level. When Andrew Jackson won the presidency in 1824, Houston had followed in pursuit of the governor's office in Tennessee in 1827. Now the stage is set for this political partnership. In many ways, it is noted among many writers that it was Jackson's plan to serve as president, ultimately to turn the presidency of the United States over to Sam Houston. No doubt sitting simply in the background to pull the strings of what was going on. And if you're going to be governor, then you're going to be living at the governor's mansion, and you'll need to have a responsible life, so therefore we're going to need a responsible wife to go along with it. And Houston focused on the daughter of a very wealthy planter and former military commander by the name of Colonel John Allen. His daughter Eliza was refined, she was genteel, she was cultured, and appeared to be a fitting example of the ideal hostess for a governor's mansion, or maybe even the first lady of the White House. On the day of their wedding, Houston was riding to the Allen plantation, and he recalled seeing a raven flutter and die in the dust on the road to the Allen plantation. His Cherokee teachings told him that that was a sign. And in many ways, he was correct about that. They married, and Houston was 37, Eliza was 18. Some writers kind of refer to the fact of separation of their age and that maybe she was actually more attracted to a distant cousin. But after all, Sam Houston was a political force and a friend of Jackson. And if there were such a thing as arranged marriages at the time, this is beginning to look like one. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are having lunch today. And so I'll not go into a great deal of detail, but remember that wound from Horseshoe Bend. Remember that wound in kind of a private place? It never really closed. It never really healed that much. This wedding was not consummated. She was repulsed so much by her husband. Not only that, but he was a crude frontiersman a bit. She was a bit refined. It was a daylight and dark relationship that ended in divorce very, very quickly. By 1829, his manhood was crushed. He was crestfallen, and he resigned his gubernatorial office the same year. Hides among a few of his friends around Nashville, but he decided to find his place among people that would be fully accepting of him. By this time, Cherokees had moved to the west, and that's exactly where Houston was bound. He was going to find Chief Jolly, his adopted father, and he was going to live among the Cherokees. These old settlers were in so many ways kind of a microcosm of the Cherokees who remained in the East. For those of us that are descended from Cherokees who came in the Trail of Tears, you'll note that there was a set of concentric circles within our nation at that time. of intermarried whites, and therefore mixed bloods, full bloods. It was a very cosmopolitan tribe. Now, the old settlers, they were in many ways kind of a different group. Houston's Indian brothers were totally dissimilar tribe, composed of mixed and full bloods as well, but they differed in education and economic levels, and they were decidedly Indian as well. More so than white, even to the planter element. And yes, there were those of landed gentry among the Western Cherokees, but they also enjoyed the advantages of the graciousness, the culture, the antebellum lifestyle, but they followed ancient Cherokee religious celebrations, and they openly made war on the Osage. I have the good fortune of working at my place of work with one of the congressmen of the Osage Nation, and I've told him in the hallway from time to time, I said, "You do realize we used to shoot your people recreationally." I don't know that we're going to be friends for a long period of time. These paradoxical Western Cherokees were more civilized than any other Indian tribe, and they were more savage, as the writer says, than the white men of the era. They were fearful of white encroachment, and they were equally unwilling to have the Cherokees who remained in Georgia and Tennessee to really come visit them here in their place in the West. Many of them having left as early, John Jolly, I think, had actually received permission from the governor of Louisiana to bring a group of Cherokees to the West as early as the 1790s. So when you look at the 1790s, the Hiwassee Purchase Group, the old settlers moving in between the White River and the Arkansas River in the 1820s, and then ultimately into what we know as northeastern Oklahoma, they were already established in the West. And history, for another day, is replete with information about the old settlers and obviously those Cherokees that came over the Trail of Tears. You know, Chief John Ross, a chief of my blood quantum, probably looked at them and said, "Well, hi, guess what? We're all home now, aren't we?" Another day, another story. The history of Houston's trek from Nashville to the West is one laced with modes of transportation, all of them fueled by whiskey. But his arrival and his homecoming are absolutely phenomenal. At the moment of his arrival, Chief John Jolly again took him into his tribe here in the West. The chief, according to stories, grasped him in his arms and he said, "My wigwam is yours. My home is yours. My people are yours. Rest with us." Less than 6 months after his arrival, Houston was formally adopted as a Cherokee. A committee was appointed by John Jolly to consider the contributions made by Houston across the years, which had been made to his people, as well as his plans for improvement. And on October the 21st of 1829, they passed a resolution adopting Sam Houston as a Cherokee citizen. Well, this puts Sam in a really interesting place. Here he is, a Cherokee citizen, not of Cherokee blood, and the rules of trade and treaties were quite refined. He's a white trader, but he's an adopted Cherokee citizen, and Cherokee traders did not need license or permission from the federal government. So he uses his citizenship as a Cherokee citizen to detour around the rules, and those that were Cherokee traders not overly happy with him. His establishment just across the way at Wigwam Neosho was a place that must have looked like a cross between a super Walmart and a Buc-ee's. Everybody that was anybody in this part of the world made their way to Wigwam Neosho. Now, in the meantime, because of his background in negotiations, he represents the Western Cherokees in Washington, D.C. He moves back and forth between Cherokees in the West and going to meet with federal officials. And it's this term in his life, these very brief years of living among the Cherokees that we find that Sam Houston now begins to really come into conflict, perhaps with himself. Catherine and I were speaking earlier that on one of his representations to Washington, D.C., he went and refused to speak in English. He's meeting with Secretary Calhoun at the time, who was enraged because he knew Houston. He knew Houston when he was a congressman from Tennessee. He knew Houston when he was a governor from Tennessee. He knew that Houston was a white man, but now he is an adopted Cherokee who adapts the dress, the traditions, the culture, and the language, and pretty much kept Calhoun pissed off during the entire negotiations, which apparently was not too much trouble in those days. Secretary Calhoun almost decided to end relations between the United States and the Western Cherokees. Many trips to Washington. On one of such trips, an Ohio congressman named William Stansbury had called out both Jackson and Houston, because once again, Houston is a traitor, literally dual license, both within the tribe and now exterior as well. There were questions of contracts. Not that it was a Doge moment, but there was, in fact, a question of contracts and who was being enriched at that time. And Congressman Stansbury decided that, well, he would make these allegations, and they made their way to the newspaper. So much so that Sam Houston saw him one evening on the streets of Washington and took a hickory stick and beat him within an inch of his life for calling out against his integrity and that of President Jackson. So much so that Stansbury, who did survive that beating, parlayed with the Speaker of the House of Congress to bring charges against Sam Houston and conduct the trial in Congress. Not in a court, but in Congress. It was a multi-day circus. And if you looked in the galleries at that time, you would find interesting brushes with greatness. The Booth brothers came to watch. As a matter of fact, one of the Booth brothers, John Wilkes Booth, would tell Houston, who told his attorney, "I'm going to make closing arguments for myself," and did so for multiple hours. And with his legal training and his knowledge of Cherokee tradition, wove on for hours. John Wilkes Booth told him, he said, you know, if you decide to get out of politics, you should think about going into theater. It was a 4-day debate. The outcome was 106 to 81, 106 guilty. Oh my. He was sentenced to a reprimand by the Speaker of the House and President Polk. They came by, and writers will tell you that the reprimand was very serious. They wagged their finger at him. And they said, "Sam Houston, you should not take a hickory stick and beat liars." Stansbury, of course, wouldn't stand for it, so he moved his grievance to civil court, and he won there an award of $500 for his beating. But President Jackson intervened and stepped into the picture and stated that, well, that was an egregious amount of money for a civil award, and therefore granted a pardon to Houston. Walked away scot-free. In many ways, gone to Texas. Now, during this period of time living with the Cherokees, Sam had noticed a young lady that kind of started our talk here today, because her headstone is there at Officer Circle. Now, if you read through the history and books that I would recommend to you, oddly enough, one that was written by a Northeastern State University graduate, none other than Renard Strickland. He debated for Dr. Valjean Littlefield and later on to law school and served as the dean of the law school at the University of Oregon and also at Oklahoma City University. And he's a great writer of Cherokee traditions, along with Jack Gregory. In their book, Sam Houston with the Cherokees, 1829 to 1833, they chronicle the many different historical names attributed to Houston's wife. She must have had like 15 of them. Is it Diane? Is it Talahina? Is it Talahina? The list goes on. But she was a striking mixed blood Cherokee girl, also quite his junior, but she was very much a Western Cherokee. There was no problem that he had seen in previous relationships, and they took up well here in this country. If you look at the Western Cherokees at that particular time, in this pan-cultural Indian community that moved back and forth between what we know as Arkansas, this section of Oklahoma, and yes, even Texas, because it was there that the Bowl, or Diwali, which is actually an Osage name, taking a group of Cherokees back and forth to northeastern Texas with great regularity. They're always attempting, first with the Mexican government, later with the Texans, to secure lands in the South. Primarily, Chief Bowles was a little upset because the land that he had settled on over in Arkansas with those old settlers was outside of their delineated area. So it's like, oh, I'm sorry, you made all these improvements here, but this is not your land. So the Bowl had come west as early as 1782, 1790s, received permission, as I mentioned earlier, from the governor of Louisiana to settle here in the West. And it was there, that relationship between Houston and the Bowl, that drove him toward Texas. The timing accelerates in Houston's life at this time. Houston decides that it is time to move on to Texas. The relationships that he had here among the Cherokees were about to abate. Now, I would tell you that my suppositions was this really his idea all along? There's one of my many cousins out here that says, well, what about the gold of John Jolly? Was there a possibility that Houston was befriending these Cherokees to be able to move funds into the Texas Revolution? Remember, Andrew Jackson has been talking about the annexation of Texas since the 1820s, and now it's full on in Texas in the 1830s. The Texas Revolution is absolutely filled with events that is way beyond today's talk, but we should mark the high marks in it. Texas provisional government was signed into effect on February the 23rd of 1836. Remember, the Battle of the Alamo occurred on February the 23rd, same day of the provisional government, and through March the 6th. I'm always quick to point out the impressiveness of less than 150 Texans against a couple of thousand Mexican troops, because after all, they lasted there for 13 days. It was not the John Wayne movie we are all familiar with. No, there was some very astute military activity that took place, delaying the advancement of General Santa Anna against the main force of the Texas Republic. But ultimately, that battle, along with the 342 Texans that were executed by Santa Anna under Fannon's command on March the 27th of 1836. All of these events delaying the advance of the Mexican army, because by now, Sam Houston, because of his great military prowess, has now been appointed the supreme commander of the Texas Revolutionary Force. He kept withdrawing, pulling in, stretching out the supply lines until, of course, we know and we've all heard of the Battle of San Jacinto on April the 21st of 1836. Houston, once again, at the very front, just as he was there at Horseshoe Bend in the War of 1812. So much so that his horse was shot out from under him, his leg was broken. If you go to the Texas Capitol today in Austin, there's a ginormous painting that they're very proud of there in their legislative hall that shows the bringing of Santa Anna, who had stripped away his general uniform, trying to hide among his own troops, but being brought to a Sam Houston who is stretched out with his leg on a blanket, broken under a tree, to accept his surrender and to accept the entirety of receiving Texas. By October the 22nd of 1836, the Republic of Texas is established, and of course Sam Houston is elected as its first president. He serves for one term, and once again, wanderlust, maybe political angling, thinking that maybe I'll return to the United States and maybe pursue a presidential pathway there. But the second president, Marabou Bonaparte Lamar, who's inaugurated in December of 1838, he was a Georgian by background who carried parallel opinions of Indian removal ideology shared by Andrew Jackson himself. Do you see the confusing twirling that's going on here? Is Houston pro-Indian or is he anti-Indian? What about these other characters and their stance? Remember what was going on in our own tribe in December of 1838. Many of our people were waiting just across the Mississippi River in Illinois from Jackson, Missouri, awaiting to make their way across the river. We lost so many in that removal. There is the real point of today's story. Because Lamar decided in the absence of Houston, who had gone back to Washington for talks, that he would in fact press the removal of those Cherokees, Kickapoos, and Creeks that had located themselves in the northeastern part of Texas. Houston would have been absolutely against this because one of his great tenets all through the establishment of the principle of the provisional government of Texas was that we must befriend the Indian and make them our neighbors. After all, he had initiated a treaty with Chief Bowl, and if we go to Chief Bowles and the Texas Cherokees by Mary Clark, a great passage here. They talk about the treaty with Diwali. It says, after signing the treaty with Bowles, General Houston reportedly presented Chief Bowles with a sword, a silk vest, and a sash, as well as, according to so many historians, a military hat. A contemporary of Bowles said, when he later saw the chief on the battlefield, that Bowles wore the hat, the vest, the sash, and carried the sword which had been given to him by Sam Houston. While Houston was in Washington, Lamar's pressing against the group, against Chief Bowles. It ended quickly. It ended very, very quickly. On July the 16th of 1839, a group of Texans surrounded the very small force of Chief Bowles, and while advanced in age, he was killed on the battlefield, and he was holding this sword, which was given to Chief Bowles by Sam Houston. The sword was recovered, and it made its way to what would be right and proper, in many ways still is, because after all, not many museums in the 1800s, so here's Chief Bowles' sword given to him by Sam Houston as a great treaty token. Where should it rest? It rested with the Masonic Lodge in Rusk, Texas. There was another group of Cherokees. Those who are of the Stars, particularly in this room, know that after the assassination of James Starr in 1844, it was my grandfather and some 300 other Cherokee families that removed to what is now Rusk County, Texas, to live in the Mount Tabor area. By then, Texas had once again, in an episode of absolute political ice road truckers, had moved from we're in favor of the Cherokees, we're against the Cherokees, we're now accepting of the Cherokees yet again. So the Masonic Lodge held this sword until the American Civil War, and Secretary Wilson, it's another story for us to tell, but it was actually loaned by the Masons to a local man who raised a regiment of troops to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and he carried it in several battles in northern Louisiana and southern Arkansas, was not killed, and returned it to the Masonic Lodge in Rusk County as though he had checked out a basketball from the YMCA. Here's your sword. In the 1890s, though, that group of Masons, in communication with the oldest Masonic Lodge in Oklahoma, now transitioning from its Arkansas charter to moving toward the Oklahoma Territorial Charter and becoming Cherokee Lodge number 10, the oldest Masonic lodge in Oklahoma, that sword was granted to the Masons here in Tahlequah, where it is safe kept today, just as it has been by the Masons since 1865. Now, I'll finish up. And I would tell you that there's an interesting tour of duty across Houston, across John Jolly, across Talahina, across the bowl, across the sword, across the Masons. You see all of the interweavings of these characters and these particular themes. So back to Houston. Followed Lamar in his second term as president of Texas in 1841 and 1844, another critical date, because by now, Houston has determined that Texas alone may not be the going concern that it should be. And he led Texas into annexation by the United States in 1845. Later elected as governor in 1859, served until 1861. He is the only man in the entire United States who has served as governor of two different states and also as president of a republic. And if he had had it his way, I'm certain he would have been the president of two republics. The lodge itself is a story all to its own. I would tell you that while our charter was issued, Mr. Secretary, in 1848 by the jurisdiction Grand Lodge of Arkansas, its officers, its very first officers, were installed at the Cherokee Supreme Court building here in Tahlequah, and oddly enough, it was kind of a public event. We Masons are oftentimes known as being a secretive, fraternity, which is not true. You can find us anywhere. But the officers were, in fact, all installed there on the second floor of the Supreme Court building on July the 12th of 1849. They've only had two buildings here in town, one being a wooden structure, the Masonic Lodge on the second floor. They leased a church, first floor to a church group, and then the present lodge building that we have today, which you know is just being off of the downtown area, where this sword and other artifacts of our people reside and have been safe kept by Cherokee Lodge number 10. As for Houston, well, serving out his second term as president and then as governor, he definitely was in a position to give advice to the citizens of Texas at the outbreak of the American Civil War. In 1861, he stood against secession. A man who had, in fact, owned slaves, a man who had been among Cherokees who were slave owners, among Texans who had that initial break with the Mexican government because of the slave laws there. But he stood against separation from the Constitution. He stood against secession and was harangued by many individuals in his state. He told the crowd on April the 19th of 1861, you see this daguerreotype of him. He was a stately man, a man who was a true campaigner. You would find that of the many images of Sam Houston across his life, sometimes clean-shaven, sometimes with a beard, as we are told by the writers, sometimes during his darker periods. He was prone to depression from time to time. And he was an able campaigner, a man who is quite known for traveling across the entirety of Texas when he ran for governor, wearing a linen white jacket and a horse and buggy. He would simply pull up. In many ways, and you older Oklahomans will know what I mean when I say this, he was sort of the George Nye of Texas. Kind of man that would step down into any community anywhere and say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Sam Houston. I was born not far from here. At least that's what George Nye used to say. On April the 19th of 1861, though, he told the crowd, he said, let me tell you what is coming. He's speaking of the American Civil War. After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasure and hundreds of thousands of lives, You may win Southern independence if God be not against you, but I doubt it. And I will tell you that while I believe with you in the doctrine of states' rights, the North is determined to preserve the Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people, as you are. Remember, he's speaking to Texans. For they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and the presence of a mighty avalanche. And what I fear is they will overwhelm the South. He was correct. Passed away peacefully in his house with a very minor balance sheet. Many people would think a man with such political power and fame and profile that he would have amassed a fortune. In many ways, his holdings were probably that of his mother Elizabeth when they moved to near the Hiwassee in Tennessee so many years earlier. He died on July the 26th of 1863. The inscription on Houston's tombs says only these words: a brave soldier, a fearless statesman, a great orator, a pure patriot, a faithful friend, a loyal citizen, a devout husband and father, a consistent Christian, and an honest man. In many ways, I don't know that anyone would aspire to have any more placed on their headstone. It is my honor to be able to come home here to Tahlequah and share with you about a man who made his way among us and made his way outside of us. But I do believe that if you look across his life, his teachings that he received from the Cherokee people, from his elders, stayed with him throughout his entire career. As conflicted as he may have been, in many ways, Sam Houston was indeed one of us. Good to be here today.